Hello. Our story begins midway through the second year of the war, inside of Padme's Coruscant residence. She and Anakin had an exciting trip from the lower levels of the city, and finally returned to the peaceful abode. They were lying on the sofa, watching the sunset across the city. The ambience of the Coruscant traffic was relaxing to the ears, and they both held each other's hands and their bodies. Nothing was really said, and truthfully, nothing really needed to be said between the two of them. They always understood what was felt. As they were quietly sitting there, Anakin's body suddenly tensed up. A surging thought ran through his mind, and he stiffened his shoulders and leaned up. Padme naturally asked what was wrong, and he admitted that he was worried for the upcoming campaign. Between Ahsoka and Obi-Wan and the clones, it was just so much. The Council always had their eyes on him, which wasn't naturally negative, but the pressure to perform was present. Traveling all the time, political deceit, chances of Padme dying or being killed, and so much more was constantly pressing on him. With her, he was able to relinquish those thoughts and harbor a more natural state of existence. Most people in the Corps never thought about the war. At Anakin's age, he should realistically be in the college districts, partying with other young adults. For that sake, Padme too. This was the time and age in his life to make decisions that weren't smart and didn't affect anyone but him until the day after. But here he was, considering the drastic events that faced the galaxy. Sometimes, infrequently he had to admit, it was too much. He didn't want to leave. He really didn't want to go back to battle. Teaching Ahsoka was a great honor, and he wouldn't trade that for anything. But what if he failed her? Or even worse, what if she died? Padme listened, while rubbing her hands across his back in circles. He finished his rampant thoughts with a statement about wishing the war had never come to begin with. The tension in his body slowly released as he looked across the city, finally dipping in the darkness. Wow, come to think of it, talking about his problems was actually really beneficial. He turned to her and apologized for ruining the moment, but there wasn't anything in her mind to apologize for. She didn't immediately jump for a problem, and she comforted him on what he had done thus far. He was always present for those that needed him, and that was the greatest gift to those who considered him an acquaintance, friend, or ally. She reminded him that firstly he didn't need to apologize, but not to put all that burden on himself, because she knew with her whole heart that the Council valued him greatly. It's why they always watched. Ahsoka and Obi-Wan were beyond appreciative, and the few clones she had spoken to, even outside of his unit, gave their praises to General Skywalker. It was a great burden, and he didn't need to harm himself with it so frequently. She tried to ease his mind by suggesting exercises to let go of that. As a senator, she experienced that greatly, even more so when she was 14 years old and the Queen of Naboo. It was always a burden to wonder how many relied on you for their protection and for your expertise that might not even be right. That was the burden of public servants. She told him it's why the good ones age so much in office, unless they're just evil. He chuckled at that, and they leaned back together. To split the conversation up, he asked if she wanted to do Corellian takeout for dinner, and she nodded. They returned to the state of silence before Padme asked Anakin a question she knew wouldn't technically be fair to ask, but she wasn't going to step on eggshells. That'd be unhealthy for both of them. But she asked Anakin if he would consider leaving the Jedi Order. He turned his head to her, genuinely perplexed by the idea, and he honestly couldn't be upset. First, that would be wrong to get mad at a question, but secondly, and perhaps most importantly, he had considered that option many times, even during the Clone Wars. Anakin bit his lip and turned back towards the city skyline, before releasing his breath, sinking further into the couch and into her embrace. He told her that it was a fair proposition, because there were so many times he wanted to leave. The war was unending. Whether it was the Senate or the CIS that continued to prolong the war, he didn't know, but it truly felt like he couldn't escape the outcome. No matter how many droids he cut down, clones he lost, or battles he won, it never seemed to be enough, and that hurt him greatly. She understood. The battle lines drawn inside the Senate were frequently unforgiving, leaving no one a chance to find resolution. He turned and asked a similar question, which she responded to with simplicity. Padme truthfully never considered leaving the Senate. It was hard and the burden was great, but she wasn't bound to a code of conduct that restricted the way she acted, thought, or felt. She was much more free despite the Senate rules and regulations, even during wartime. Anakin, though, was bound to a marriage he couldn't participate in healthily, and he asked her, as a result, what she thought. Padme had always been in his corner. She wouldn't ever leave him or suggest he do something she thought would hurt him. She knew very well that he had considered leaving the Order a multitude of times, so this conversation and questioning didn't just appear out of nothingness. It was a calculated moment. To answer him or give a suggestion, she expressed that while he was instructing Ahsoka, he didn't need to feel glued to the Order. He could perhaps still instruct her if he left, right? Anakin thought on it. Maybe not within the Jedi rules, but they could continue instruction without the Jedi Order, theoretically. Padme wasn't necessarily suggesting that Anakin ask Ahsoka to leave the Order as well, but it was something that could realistically happen. This residence was large enough for everyone they cared about. Hell, ask Obi-Wan to join, and they could play house. Anakin choked on spit and started coughing hard, as he was laughing. Suggesting Obi-Wan was hilarious, and it caught him off guard. But for a moment, he sat there and thought, and told her that he would think about it. The following day, after having an upset stomach thanks to the Corellian takeout, Anakin started his regimental training for Ahsoka. Deployment was coming, so their training was regulated to the temple. They were sparring together. Skywalker started with some real trash talk, before speaking with a little more control. Their weapons batted once and pulled away, as he asked her what she thought of the war. Ahsoka naturally spouted off something she believed about the Jedi, like being bringers of peace and justice. She asked why, and he asked with another question, garnering another programmed Jedi response. This was simply the teachings of the Order, but Ahsoka's own twist was thrown in with her responses, because of her own individuality and some of the things she spoke about with her friends since the beginning of the war. Their weapons clashed again, and they spun around, before she asked him the same question. Anakin steadied himself, and admitted that he was having ranging thoughts about remaining a Jedi, but his main and truthfully largest concern was her. He looked sincerely at the Jedi he loved like a little sister, and told her that he wouldn't abandon her. He promised that much. It was a really sweet sentiment, because the sibling-like love was real for her too. She adored the one she considered an older brother. But where was he going with this? She was a little upset by it, not because of his wants, but because she didn't want to be abandoned. He affirmed that he wouldn't leave if she wouldn't be comfortable with it. But that in of itself was a burden for her to bear. If she didn't want to leave and he therefore didn't, then he wouldn't be happy. But if she wasn't okay with it and lied, then she would be paired up with someone else and wouldn't be happy. Luckily for her, it would probably be Obi-Wan, but that wasn't something she really wanted to think about, or really wanted, no offense to Kenobi. Her saber deignited and she asked what was going on inside his head, not as an insult, but just a worry. He placed his own weapon on his belt, and told her that he felt that there was no winning in the way they were waging combat. Maybe he was just tired and wanted to be at his own home, subtly suggesting that he already had something lined up for him. But Anakin, aside from the burden, which was as real as what he told Padme the night before, felt incapable of finding resolution through combat. His shoulders rolled, placing his hands behind his back, and he looked out the window, to which she joined him by his side, wondering what Anakin would say next. He, typically not the one for speaking highly of the mysticisms of the Force, told his apprentice that something was wrong. In his heart, in his mind, and in the Force, he knew that this wasn't right, but because of the constant combat, he hadn't found the time to question it or counsel himself inside his mind. Having spoken to a close friend outside the Order, he believed that the right path would be removing himself from the Jedi. Ahsoka thought about the prospect of losing him, and he stopped those thoughts by speaking aloud that he would never abandon her, again reaffirming this, no matter what. He also didn't want this decision to hinge on her, because he recognized that that was also unfair. So he proposed that he would and could still train her, but they wouldn't theoretically be Jedi anymore. Ahsoka, despite being 16, wasn't dumb enough to just jump into something. So she asked one very important question. For Anakin, it would determine her decision. Ahsoka asked what he had lined up outside the Order that made him so confident with having somewhere to go. Anakin looked around and turned towards her. He thought for a moment, and explained that she would need to keep this quiet, like a total secret. She nodded her head, and he told her that he was married to Senator Amidala. The two of them lived together when he wasn't on the battlefront, and it's why they were always such good friends, for no apparent reason. Ahsoka's jaw dropped, and she thought for a moment, before remembering sometimes when this should have been really just easy to figure out. Total silence filled the hall, and Anakin turned his back to the city. She spoke up and asked if that's why they always came to this training hall. He turned with a questioning face, and she pointed across the city, telling him that he was looking at Padme's residence, right? He chuckled a little and nodded, letting her siphon through her own thoughts before she told her master that she wanted to meditate on it. He understood. Before she left the training room, she asked if anyone else knew, and he shook his head. That made her heart warm, and she smiled before leaving. It meant a lot to her that he trusted her with this information. The next campaign for the 501st was coming by at the end of the week, and the troops were prepping themselves for another long haul. Anakin had spoken with Masters Kenobi and Windu, while also assisting Rex with some other preparations. As he was walking from the main bridge of the Venator, Ahsoka ran into him and asked to speak alone. He nodded. They turned down a corridor and stopped, and she asked if he'd be okay with training her without the Jedi Order, and he obviously nodded. She had thought about it and even spoken to her friend Barris about her thoughts, and she was given some clarity. Ahsoka did feel bad because the clones of the 501st would be without them, but Rex was intelligent enough to thrive even without them. They were 2 Jedi in an army of thousands. The 501st were fantastic alone anyways. Anakin understood her grief, but he promised that they could end the war before they lost all of their brothers. Despite doing his work with the clones and the Jedi generals inside the temple, he'd been spending time with Padme at night. They had discussed the potential of handling the Clone Wars and ending the conflict without actual battle. He had a few strategies that they might be able to implement. Their Jedi skills would give them more leeway to act as citizens and refugees. Anakin and Ahsoka quietly abandoned the Venator and visited the High Council chambers, where they would inform the minds of the Council of their decision. It did come at a great surprise for everyone, but the Council was compassionate. It wasn't the Council's choice to decide if one should stay within the Order or not. They thanked them for their service, transparency, and their time, and wished that the Force carry them well in their coming journeys. Obi-Wan was very hurt by this, and it was because Anakin hadn't spoken to him about it. Skywalker did consider his master before leaving, but Obi-Wan wouldn't need Anakin. Ahsoka did. Kenobi would follow them from the council chambers to confront his apprentice. The conversation would be very similar to the one shared between Anakin and Ahsoka the day before, but Obi-Wan was, like the counselors, very understanding and compassionate. It did hurt him because he loved his apprentice, and Ahsoka. When Anakin expressed his feelings and frustrations, Obi-Wan couldn't help but understand. It was a frustrating time and they weren't winning. He wouldn't end up joining Skywalker and Tano, but he was willing to help him with whatever he needed if anything came up. Even if Anakin wasn't a Jedi, he was still Obi-Wan's friend and former apprentice. Ahsoka and Anakin were especially grateful for Obi-Wan's kindness. The return to Padme's residence was slightly euphoric, and also a little worrying. They still had their lightsabers. The council trusted them enough to allow them to keep their weapons. Things were a little weird though. They'd both just abandoned their entire way of life. They had support through Obi-Wan and Padme, but it was still reasonably a little worrying. When they arrived at the apartment, they relaxed. There was a genuine relief that they both experienced. Perhaps it wasn't something they could just express to each other because it was a constantly moving cycle of joining and leaving battle. But now, without a campaign coming up, without battles to actively participate in, they sat on the sofa across from each other and just euphorically laughed. They were free at last, and they leaned backwards, taking in that moment. There was a little bit of grief and a lot of guilt, but overwhelmingly, they were free, and that remained their experience for the next few hours until they surprised Padme when she returned home. They'd have dinner, talk, and play house for the night. Everything was really bizarre for the married couple, because this was the first time in their lives, aside from Padme's family, that they openly displayed their marriage to someone they knew. They had of course spoken about it quite a few times if they wanted to include Ahsoka or even Obi-Wan into their family, but the answer was always the same. They were going to wait until after the war to do it. With the sun rising, Anakin and Ahsoka began their new life. which included accompanying Padme to the Senate building to meet with members of the Loyalist Committee. As the war was going on, allies that opposed beginning the war started siding with Palpatine, but not all of them. With the Mina Bonteri assassination out of the way, Padme wanted her friends and colleagues to help her with giving Anakin and Ahsoka missions. Mon Mothma proposed diving deep into Separatist territory and working behind enemy lines, but that was also semi-problematic in the way it was framed. These discussions continued throughout the day, because this wasn't a major voting day anyways, so they had time. Anakin and Ahsoka brainstormed frequently together to try and gather something. What became the main theme of these discussions and meetings was ending the war in a more effective diplomatic way. At some point during the day, Anakin would meet with Captain Rex to inform him of the change. The soon-to-be new clone commander was very understanding and empathetic. He wished Ahsoka and Anakin luck on their endeavors. As it was described by Anakin, he was trying to end the war before more clones needlessly died. To Rex and eventually the clones of the 501st, this was very honorable. There were no hard feelings towards Skywalker or Tano because of it. Despite attempting to get headway on their new mandate, there wasn't a ton of movement early on. The bickering between senators left Ahsoka and Anakin quite frustrated. He truthfully didn't know how Padme had the patience to deal with this, but even with the growingly tense discussions, Anakin had more time to train Ahsoka. Most of it was meditative, but it was nice. The quietness of Padme's office provided the two of them a serene environment to harmonize with the Force. Then it finally clicked. Their mission, their directive, the one thing that no one else could do or was willing to do. They would act as spies behind enemy lines to end the war, basically what Mon Mothma suggested. Padme annoyedly told them that the Senate always slowed things down. It had been maybe a week or so since they left the Order, and they had very little progress as a result. But she did suggest that they leave for Raxus Secundus as soon as possible with this new directive. They didn't have a specific directive, so Padme suggested that they focus on working as citizens, transfers to the local government. She handed them 2 passports and entry-level resumes that would allow them to act within the CIS government without being noticed. The 2 of them promptly left Coruscant for the CIS capital. Upon arrival as citizens, they were ferried through some minor checkpoints before being released into the city. On this level, the galaxy felt incredibly large. They were basically 2 atoms in a sea of faces. They had decided on their approach and got started immediately. Thanks to Padme, their positions inside the government meant that they could slip between offices and overhear important conversations. A lot of these senators had frustrations, grievances, and even annoyances with the war. No one wanted a prolonged conflict, and the 2 former Jedi would overhear this. Recordings would be kept and sent off to Padme. The only way to end this war was by showing that people didn't want it. As a result, she would send similar recordings from the Republic to Anakin and Ahsoka. It was very hard intercepting communication from and to Coruscant, but the former Jedi were able to utilize an off-the-grid location with a custom-made communication relay. Anakin and Ahsoka weren't staying inside the city. They lived in the forest because they also needed to continue their training, which they couldn't do inside the city. They also didn't forget that Dooku was a Sith Lord, and he would take up a large problem with them inside of his government. It was much safer for them to linger outside the city gates. But just because they were getting information about Republic senators and representatives that didn't want to fight from Padme, it didn't mean they laid it on the Separatist leadership. The key to the spy game was figuring out the motivation of the CIS government, while also exposing assets belonging to the CIS Council or the war branch of the government. This mission didn't start combative, but it certainly would build to it. As it became evident, the CIS government was being held almost for ransom by the military branch. If they didn't pay the council, then they would be left without an army, navy, or military in general. Dooku obviously wouldn't actually withhold it, but he put a bet on the Separatist Senate, fearing it. This was theoretically a game of risk, because Dooku couldn't openly threaten people prior to them joining the CIS. He also couldn't take away the military, so it was entirely a scheme, and it relied heavily on the Senate remaining semi-complacent. Anakin and Ahsoka unraveled pieces of this, and it started with a separate mission to a CIS Foundry world. The mission came from credit sheets depicting funding for the Separatist military through a credit loan that went through Scipio. The bank was taking funds and depositing it into the specific foundry, which the Republic had no idea existed. After training for weeks on Raxus and gathering intel, this strike would prove to test them the most. The test wasn't in combat, because they swept through battle droids without any struggle. It was more of their analysis skills. They rushed into the complex, knocking off guards and gutting the security personnel, all of which being battle droids. When they entered the main command chambers, they'd find members of the CIS Council. In their hands, which Anakin laughingly removed, were documents that positioned the CIS into an unfavorable economic position. This went hand in hand with the recent purchase of 15 or so million new battle droids. So, as the two Jedi gathered this evidence, they captured the counselors and brought them back to Raxus with them. Anakin and Ahsoka would, with their evidence, display the several clips they received from Amidala of wishes for a ceasefire. The Separatist leaders weren't very happy with this revelation, because it meant Anakin and Ahsoka were spies, but it also meant that they had very important evidence. The CIS was also being financially bankrupted for no reason, and the Republic didn't really even want the war. There were fears if they could trust these spies, obviously, but Padme had given the two former Jedi enough evidence prior to them leaving that the Republic had absolutely nothing to do with Mina Bontiri's assassination. Anakin and Ahsoka didn't stay present for long. They just distributed the information and left, but they didn't actually leave the planet yet. The main reason Ahsoka and Anakin were here was to end the war. They also wanted to leave so they could get back to Padme and find their own paths for living life. What they started here on Raxus very quickly became the talking point galaxy-wide, because a lot of grievances expressed by Separatist leadership was also shared with the Republic. So two sides had a multitude of senators who wanted to end the war. Dooku and Palpatine couldn't cover this up or stop it like they did before, because bombing the Coruscant power grid and assassinating a singular senator wouldn't do it. This was dozens of senators willingly from both sides of the aisle in both governments proclaiming that they were done with the conflict. It was a minor blow, but Dooku had also discovered the culprits. The two Jedi didn't leave the planet yet to make sure that there wasn't an escalation made by the Sith, but there wouldn't be. Dooku allowed the Senate to begin its ramblings, and he personally went into the forests of Raxus to confront his young opponents to kill them. Sidious was not informed of who these leaks came from. It was just seen as a separatist traitor, and ironically, it was the Dark Lord of the Sith that told Tyrannus to kill the perpetrators. Anakin and Ahsoka were in the middle of a meditation. Their acts, while semi-stressful, felt resolved. They could feel the switch in the Force, the pull towards peace. Night was falling on the planet. Master and apprentice were ready to go home, to an actual home. This would be their last night on Raxus. Once their meditation finished, it was completely black outside. The trees sat in their way and they gathered up their supplies, preparing to leave, when a crimson lightsaber ignited. They turned over and saw Dooku staring at them from afar. He slipped between trees, speaking with a deep and unsatisfied voice. He had been searching for them since the security recordings were presented to him. As he got closer, he revealed what he knew, to a degree. Most of it was the fact that he had told the senators the truth about his regime, but Dooku was too far gone. He believed in the destruction of the CIS and the Republic to fulfill the Empire. He raised a saber and promised that Ahsoka would have a short and painless death. Two green lightsabers shot open, and a blue one ignited, as Skywalker stood in front of his Padawan. So much for abandoning the actual war effort. Dooku swung in, clobbering down against Anakin. He blocked readily and stepped around a tree stump and batted at his opponent. Ahsoka leapt through the air and swung down. Dooku turned back and flung electricity at her, which she blocked only for him to swing into her defenses once she landed. Anakin attacked through a tree, and Dooku turned back at the right time to block Anakin. The tree then slipped down between them and smashed into the ground. Ahsoka, using another tree, avoided Dooku and attacked him. Anakin ran behind and added to the barrage. The Count swiftly avoided strikes, spinning through the air and landing without struggle. Despite their young age and his old, he was a ferocious duelist. Anakin recognized that they wouldn't win a normal battle, and he told Ahsoka, "Jedi don't run." She clocked what this meant, or what he was referencing. and the two of them rushed away from the Count. He swung in at them, and he chased. As he prepared to lob electricity at them, they turned around, and Anakin raised his hands, aiding Ahsoka as he threw her towards Dooku. At the same moment, he fired electricity at what was supposed to be Anakin's back. Tyrannus couldn't stop this attack, and as he tried to pull his saber into his hand, Ahsoka swept her blade down across his body. It went from the top of his left shoulder to his hip, slicing him across his entire chest and abdomen. He stumbled, and she raised her weapons before Anakin arrived to watch Dooku fall to his knees. The two of them stood over his body and decided that it was time to leave. They grabbed their supplies and departed from the capital. Because of the location Dooku was murdered, his body wouldn't ever be found, further exasperating frustrations from the Separatists. It's not that people didn't check the area, it's that the native carnivores ate his remains and left nothing for anyone to find. So for senators and representatives that attempted to challenge Dooku on the evidence presented by Skywalker and Tano about their budgeting problems, he was a first no-show and then a complete ghost who vanished from the galaxy. It, in their minds, proved that the CIS was a front to gain Dooku power in some capacity, thus revealing that their own government was just simply a mirror to the Republic. This shift inside the CIS government had half of it demanding for peace, for simplicity's sake, because there was no reason to fight. It was rather hopeless, and even despondent for many of them, but within days the Separatist movement caved in on itself because of Dooku. The ceasefire request was received, and it made the floor inside the Senate Rotunda on Coruscant. Sidious was frustratedly trying to gain control over the CIS because Dooku was a no-show, but he didn't have the time for that because of the constant meetings and votes inside the Republic, and he also had no other valuable assets intelligent enough to actually do it. Anakin and Ahsoka, on the other hand, returned to Padme's home and continued playing house. Padme was beyond happy that they were safe, and she had a lot more work because of it, but there was a sensible ceasefire because of them. The Jedi were actively participating in this. Due to the break in conflict, the Jedi were permitted to be within the Senate on Coruscant and on Raxus to try and help broker the peace treaty. Padme, Anakin, and Ahsoka, though, just lived as if they were any other family. This wasn't quite the adults adopting Ahsoka, but more of a home situation. Everyone was comfortable, and despite Anakin training his student, they were both kind of jumpy. They couldn't sit still, and Padme didn't usually get home until late at night. Their big tasks of the day were cooking, which was as chaotic as it sounds. You know, Anakin, fire, not a good combo. But it was the best way for them to contribute to home life. It was weird though, because despite feeling the joy of peace, relaxation, and serenity, Anakin and Ahsoka were both semi-irritable. This came from the fact that there was almost always nothing to do, and that was hard on them. They were both active people. They needed something to do, and without it, they felt purposeless. The cooking was helpful, but Anakin and Ahsoka needed something else. With the war slowly fizzling out, the two former Jedi started taking up side quests as a means of entertainment. Their short stint on Raxus became a thing of frequent conversation for them. They continued their training with each other, practicing in the Force and lightsaber combat. The first time they did lightsaber combat, they did it in the living room, and they broke a table by accident. Padme also wasn't really thrilled about that, so they stopped doing it in the living room and did it on the roof of the building. Anakin, also as a stay-at-home husband, was able to support Padme with anything she needed, in the same way that she was there for him weeks and almost months beforehand. The peace talks were politically grueling for everyone involved, but the Jedi who frequented both the Senate and the CIS government were able to figure out the plot to destroy the galaxy. Palpatine, after realizing what befell Dooku, came up with his own counter-strategy, which involved Grievous. With the Jedi closing in on him and peace coming to the galaxy, Palpatine prepped every single contingency order, and on the day of activation, which would have been the same day as the peace treaties were signed, he would be killed by the Jedi Council in a calculated strike. The death of Dooku and Grievous and the neutrality of the post-ceasefire galaxy allowed the High Council to maneuver in territory they weren't permitted before. Due to everything consuming Palpatine, without functional allies to really help him, the Jedi were able to slip his guard, and he paid the ultimate price for it. The trio living in Padme's residence didn't know about this, and it wouldn't really cross their minds. A news report about Palpatine's disappearance would be filed, but nothing more. Anakin and Ahsoka, though, had their own more important side quests. They were basically the unemployed friends. They were assisting a local garage operator with tracking down the death stick dealing maniac. He was the ultimate distributor in that area of town, and after dealing with him, the two would be given access to help inside the garage, if they wanted, which Anakin loved because he could juice up any speeder he wanted. The two of them simply just needed something to do, and this was their outlet. They'd return and work for some random people in the city, just for the fun of it. It wasn't even something they didn't enjoy. They had the time of their lives working with them. The Jedi training of course remained relatively imperative to Ahsoka, but once she was taught far enough by Anakin that he couldn't go much further, it slowly faded from relevance for the two of them. Despite not having any children for a couple years, Ahsoka would basically be their child. Not really, but kinda. Ahsoka, Anakin, and Padme had time to truly develop as a family unit before there were any actual children. Padme's importance inside the Republic was a stark contrast to whatever Anakin and Ahsoka were doing, either together or individually. Their work inside the garage led to Ahsoka starting up her own workshop. Anakin continued just doing side quests for the fun of it. When their first child, Luke, was born, Anakin would refrain from the side quests a little and help out Ahsoka with her shop, while also mastering the art of sous chef in the kitchen with Ahsoka. During the years leading up to this, Obi-Wan and Rex would be included in their family, joining some weekends for gatherings and definitely spending time together during Republic holidays. The end of the Clone War may have been stressful for Padme especially, but without the Sith actively trying to kill her, she wasn't nearly as concerned for her life as she would have been. And even though the war that consumed the galaxy was pretty much ended by Anakin and Ahsoka, there was nothing more important to either of them than their larger than ever found family. And that, my friends, is our story. Again, special thanks to all the patrons for supporting the channel. Smash that like button. Let's talk about, I think this is a wholesome PP story. Let's talk about the wholesome PP. More than anything, I didn't want this story to be a Revenge of the Sith based. I think there's a lot of alternates you could do. You could do an alternate at the beginning of the war, you can do an alternate at the end of the war, and I chose in the middle of the war. I thought that it'd be fun to go this direction. I also didn't want the rationale for leaving the Order to fully be based on the relationship with Padme. I very specifically wanted to kind of highlight the stresses of war on Anakin, and also the stresses of war on Padme, because they're both very stressful positions. Both are public servants, and that is like the reflection in both their lives. But I wanted to highlight that they have the potential to be a good relationship. They have the potential to work out, because they do love each other. It's just that they're frequently unhealthy. And this is them being healthy, and it's not leaving the Order because of their relationship, it's leaving the Order because the war is drastically messing up the head of someone who's like 20 to 21 years old, which, you know, that's kind of normal. So that was kind of the whole basis for it. And then I kind of want to throw in some like little spy element, but I didn't want to go too deep into the C-SPAN story part of this. I wanted this to stay rather wholesome, focus on the relationship between Anakin and Padme, and the ones between Anakin and Ahsoka, as well as Ahsoka with Anakin and Padme. So I hope you all enjoyed. I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.